One of my favorite things to learn about when researching episodes is how people marketed inventions that had never been on the market before. In the Story Behind Post-its, we talked about how 3M's style of marketing was to show what the product could do rather than just showing the product. In the Story Behind Dr. Pepper, John W. Davis made it a point to tell 6 people every day his version of the beverage's origin story. And probably in the running for the most audacious marketing of an invention covered by the Story Behind is today's topic, when its inventors rented a kangaroo to help demonstrate the fun jumping capabilities of this product. You're listening to The Story Behind, the extraordinary history of the ordinary. I'm your host, Emily Prokop, and this is The Story Behind the Trampoline. But first, a quick message. Did you know Emily Prokop wasn't always my name? It's my married name. And since taking the name a few years back, I've heard all sorts of mispronunciations and misspellings my husband never warned me about before getting married. Spellcheck likes to suggest pork chop as my last name. But luckily, when you search Amazon for The Story Behind by Emily Porkchop, my book still comes up, which helps out a lot since there are a lot of other books called The Story Behind, believe it or not. Go ahead, try searching The Story Behind by Emily Porkchop. And while you're there, I'd love it if you left a review if you enjoyed the book. Me and the rest of the Porkchop family, thank you so much. Long before the invention of trampolines, humans have loved the exhilaration of jumping into the air and, for a moment, feeling weightless. It wasn't always for the thrill. Native Alaskans historically used sealskin to toss each other in the air in order to spot animals in the distance so they could hunt them. There's even a festival called Nalakatuk that involves a blanket toss, which celebrates this tradition. Court jesters in the Middle Ages would rest a thin wooden plank on blocks and bounce on it, creating a spring-like action. This was called the leaps. But according to lore, it was a French circus performer named Du Trampoline who added spring suspensions to the net below the trapeze artists. As time went on, trapeze artists worked the springing net into their act, performing on it as well as above it. However, as I said, this is lore, and there isn't documented evidence of this, but the name stuck around long enough for a particular gymnast years later to receive the nickname Campeón de Trampoline when he was performing in Mexico. That gymnast was George Nissen, who went on to invent the modern-day trampoline in 1936. George Nissen was 10 years old when he began his training as a gymnast, swimmer, and diver. But as a child, he was fascinated when he went to the circus and saw the springy nets that trapeze artists would dismount into. When he was a teenager, he and his coach, Larry Griswold from the University of Iowa, were inspired to create what was known as a bouncing rig. They attached a piece of canvas to a steel frame with some tire inner tubes, which would later be replaced with springs. And when Nissen jumped on it, he found he was able to leap into a back somersault with ease. Nissen called it the trampoline after the nickname he received in Mexico. It became successful in acrobatics and gymnastics, but also became a part of military and astronaut training. Shortly after nylon was invented in the 1930s, which we talked about in The Story Behind Pantyhose, the canvas on trampolines was replaced with nylon webbing. Aside from the obvious physical fitness aspect of it, people enjoyed the fun of the trampoline. And in the 50s, gas stations had jump stations, where kids could get out of the car while their parents pumped gas and jump on trampolines set up. When Nissen added the kangaroo to his demonstration, like I talked about earlier, he found if he put the kangaroo at one end of the trampoline and jumped on the other end, the kangaroo would end up bouncing even higher. But in the 70s, when trampolines were easily accessible and small enough to be kept in the home, there were several claims of injuries, including paralysis. Unfortunately, the Nissen Corporation couldn't afford to insure against these claims, and the company shut down by 1989. But Nissen was said to have continued to enjoy bouncing on the trampoline until the age of his death at 96. The trampoline craze still goes through ebbs and flows, and in 2000, the trampoline was added to the Olympic events. The first thing I looked up when I was researching this episode was the difference between a rebounder and a trampoline. Apparently, a rebounder is a smaller trampoline, but because it's designed for use specifically for rebounding, it's known as a rebounder. So it's basically defining itself with itself. But if you have kids, you may find they are automatically drawn to both of these, either a trampoline or a rebounder, especially with the popularity of trampoline parks now. However, because of the risk of injuries, the American Academy of Pediatrics strongly discourages the use of them. In case you're wondering how many injuries, a study found that 6,932 injuries in 2014 happened at trampoline parks. In 2010, that number was only 600. The difference between 6,932 and 600 is a lot, but these numbers are a little misleading. The study looked at indoor trampoline parks, which weren't as popular in 2010. In fact, in 2014, there were more than 350 parks, while back in 2010, there were only 25. However, another thing to consider when looking at these injury numbers is the severity of the injuries. More injuries occur in the home, and they usually include sprains and fractures. But the injuries at trampoline parks were more likely to be dislocations. Oh, and don't just assume these are all kids. 19% of these injuries were adults. However, most experts agree if proper guidelines are set, the risk from trampolines decrease significantly. This includes not letting children younger than 6 jump on them, and not having more than one person on the trampoline at a time. And I'm sure that goes for kangaroos as well. Information for this episode was sourced from the New York Times, The Independent, NPR, and more links which can be found in the show notes at thestorybehindpodcast.com. This week on Trivia Tuesday in the Story Behind discussion group on Facebook, Moxie posted that KGB once shipped a Sidewinder missile through the mail. Glenn, with 2 N's, responded, on a related note, the U.S. Postal Service once delivered mail from New York City to Florida in 30 minutes by missile. Glenn, with 1 N, posted, the first Valentine's cards were sent in the 18th century. Initially, these were handmade efforts, as pre-made cards were not yet available. Lovers would decorate paper with romantic symbols, including flowers and love knots, often including puzzles and lines of poetry. Those who were less inspired could buy volumes that offered guidance on selecting the appropriate words and images to woo their lover. These cards were then slipped secretly under a door or tied to a door knocker. If you'd like to talk about trivia you pick up during the week and have it read on the show, join the Story Behind discussion group on Facebook. This episode is brought to you by the Story Behind executive producers, who support the show through the Patreon page at patreon.com/thestorybehind, and who get access to the full scripts of these episodes before they even go live, and a bonus episode every month. The full list of executive producers can be found at thestorybehindpodcast.com/executive producers. Thanks for listening. Court gestures. Every time. I always say gestures. Maybe they are court jesters who make court gestures. This is going in my list of words never to use in an episode.